We're gonna go over in-season endurance for wrestling, and we're gonna start right now. So the panic sets in. It's every wrestler's biggest fear. Are we doing enough endurance work? Am I actually going to have that engine so that I can last in overtime and become victorious and have my hand raised so that I can become a champion? And what's the outcome? Most wrestlers that are panic-stricken with their endurance tend to just keep piling on more and more running, more and more endurance work. And what ends up happening is they're fatigued. They have poor sleep. They're malnourished because they're not actually focusing on their nutrition because they think that they have to add more endurance so that they can last later in the period, and they're trying to suck their body weight down at the exact same time, so they also get absurdly weak. Does this sound familiar? I know you are watching right now. I know this is what you guys do. And so we have to figure out, how can we actually balance resistance-based training to maintain strength, to maintain impulse expression, to maintain that explosivity, and at the same time, build endurance upon that athlete. We have to look at a couple key factors if we want to focus on building out endurance. So that first key factor is understanding what actually improves endurance. If we look at VO2 max and if we look at hemoglobin, okay, they have a direct correlation together. So if we can focus on getting in the sauna, that's a quick way to add breadth to our hemoglobin levels, which in turn will have a great impact on our VO2 max. The next thing, there's been research done that can show that if we're doing sprint-based work just for 6 weeks, that can have an immediate impact on blood volume levels. That in turn leads to an improvement in VO2 max. So some of these key concepts now, if we understand that VO2 max is the volume of oxygen consumption at its maximum performance, at its maximum peak, that's gonna help provide the muscles the amount of oxygen that they need to actually fire late inside of the match. Now, some of the other key concepts here is that we also have to make sure that we're doing resistance-based training, using mechanical tension, potentially metabolic stress, potentially muscular damage, to improve that power output when the athlete is actually fatigued. So that's some of the key concepts around endurance-based training, especially in season. Now, some of the key factors that we use when training South Dakota State's wrestling team and helping to develop Tanner Sloan, Clay Carlson, these absolutely fantastic machines that do a ton of technical work with their coaches, is that we also try to focus on at least 2 days a week of resistance-based training. Now, one day can focus on some upper body strength. That second day typically will have some type of plyometric primer along with some impulse focus. If we think about wrestling, think about David Taylor, Kyle Dake, Jordan Burrow highlights, John Smith hitting that low leg single. That's blast impulse. So we have to maintain a lot of explosive action by doing those plyometric primers while trying to factor in the different aspects around endurance-based training. And that's where we're gonna go now. How do we build out endurance-based training even inside of peak strength? And that takes us to that next step, is that remember, we are in season. So if we're a strength coach like myself, one of the big factors that I need to do is that when I talk to South Dakota State, I have to talk to their coaches and break down, okay, Cody, what are we doing in the wrestling room? How much volume are you doing with specific work inside of the wrestling room? What are the days that are gonna be really hard? What are the days that are gonna be live? What are the days that we can actually try to focus on potentially doing more resistance-based work? So we have to have some line of communication with the specific sport coach to factor in where that volume is gonna be. So some of those big questions that we all have to ask ourselves is, one, if they're going live, how frequently will that happen? When someone is going live in wrestling in season, it's going to be very intense. So typically we either need to do some type of plyometric work earlier in the day before we go live in the afternoon, or make sure that we're recovered from those live sessions. Second big aspect, how frequently are you gonna be doing flow wrestling? Are you gonna be doing maybe live drilling to a point, but more so just flow wrestling for periods of like 20 to 25 minutes? That's a form of LSD, that's long, slow distance. So when we break down the types of endurance work, we have to look at sprint interval training, which we know increases VO2 max. We have to look at high intensity interval training, and we have to look at that long, slow distance. So now, if we know that twice a week, we're gonna be doing flow periods of 20 to 25 minutes, that can factor into the total number of LSD minutes that build out our endurance protocol. That takes us to the next aspect. A lot of wrestling coaches like to do high intensity interval work. They like to do sprint interval work at the end of practice. How often in a week are we actually doing that? That's the third aspect that's going to influence our total endurance numbers when we're trying to improve our cardio for wrestling. And in my opinion, typically interval work is hit very regularly when we're looking at live drilling, we're looking at flow, we're looking at live wrestling. That's going to be covered inside of your wrestling practice. So that should really take care of that high intensity interval-based training aspect of your in-season endurance. So one of the big factors that coaches tend to miss in season is that they're not looking at the supporting endurance, that's supporting sustained endurance. So we're just beating down the wrestlers with a lot of high intensity interval work, but we're not really looking at what that LSD does, okay? So one of the big factors that we do inside of Peak Strength is we might say, all right, let's get on the assault bike for 20 minutes and try to hold that for 60 RPMs or 65 RPMs for 20 straight minutes. That's gonna build a really, really strong base. Along with this, you could look at a 5K or a 7K and do that at a very, very slow pace, like an 11-minute mile pace. That's also gonna help build upon that foundation that then when you add that high intensity interval work, now the aerobic capacity has that volume that it can handle that, and it can improve your mitochondrial respiration, which in turn leads to greater VO2 max, which in turn leads to greater endurance. And then that brings us to those key numbers. I believe that in season, we should be looking at getting at least 90 minutes of LSD work. So that could be doing the flow wrestling. Let's say you do 2 sessions of 30 minutes. That's gonna leave us with another 30 minutes of LSD work. So if we do 2 flow sessions that are 30 minutes a pop, then we should go out for a run for about 30 minutes later on in the week. Or we could get on the assault bike and do 30 minutes of easier assault bike work. That's gonna be one of those key concepts. If we're looking at high intensity interval work, I would say start with at least 40 minutes a week of that high intensity interval based work. And then if we're looking at sprint interval work, where it's gonna be a little bit harder, like 10-second goes, followed by about 50 seconds rest, that's something where we could look at about 15 minutes a week, maybe up to 20 minutes if you have somebody who's a more advanced wrestler. But all of those things, the sprints and the high intensity interval work, we have to figure out how many minutes in a week we're doing live drilling and how many minutes in a week we're doing live wrestling, and then build that into that overarching formula. And then finally, what are some other key factors that wrestlers can control themselves? We need to make sure that our iron levels are up to par. That plays a major role with overall hemoglobin levels. Hemoglobin is a protein that delivers oxygen to the muscles. Okay, that's a big concept here. Now, the next thing, you can get into the sauna post-exercise 3 to 4 days a week for 30 minutes, and that alone will also lead to greater recovery and greater mitochondrial volume. We also need to make sure that we're eating well. If we're wrestling and we're doing all this aerobic work and we're doing all this resistance-based work and we're doing all this technical skill work, we have to make sure our nutrition is up to par so that we can recover and have enough energy to feel good when we step out onto the mat. And then finally, some wrestlers feel really, really good when they start using something like beta-alanine, about 5 grams. So these are all those key aspects that you can use to improve your overall in-season endurance for wrestling. Because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion, you've always got to cultivate your power. Peace.